St. Peter's Square with St. Peter's Basilica, or just St. Peter's. It's a monumental, magnificent building with larger-than-life statues of the apostles that come across as divine images. It's the most impressive monument of the Renaissance. The colossal colonnades are reminiscent of ancient temples. St. Peter's is the largest church in the world. Just a few generations before its time, it would have been impossible to construct such an edifice. Nobody would have been able to plan and organize all the work. Nobody had the necessary knowledge of mathematics, physics, and structural engineering. People would simply have been unable. Then, in the mid-16th century, artists and scholars made their entry onto the stage of history. It was the age of the Renaissance. They managed to do what had seemed impossible for the previous 1,000 years. Within just 4 generations, they had the knowledge to implement such massive projects as St. Peter's. It's as if a turbocharger had accelerated Europe's development. The driving forces were men like Michelangelo Buonarroti, polymaths who found solutions to all the problems so that the seemingly impossible became possible. Their achievements still resonate today. But what was their secret? The secret of an age in which the world seemed to undergo a paradigm shift, the age of the Renaissance. Rome in 1547. Among the all-rounders of the Renaissance, this man stood out, Michelangelo Buonarroti. At the construction site for St. Peter's, probably the largest in Europe, he was project manager, architect and artist, all in one. 72 years old by this time, he was still a man driven by ambition. Michelangelo was a titan of the Renaissance. He was a painter, sculptor, architect, a scientist, a nuisance, and a genius, an all-round talent. One of his works became the icon of an entire era, and he himself became the prototype of the modern man who entered the world stage with the Renaissance. Michelangelo's David is the best-known sculpture in art history. Men like Michelangelo were the managers of an era in which art and culture, knowledge and technology developed at near lightning speeds. Florence in 1501. Michelangelo surprised his contemporaries with works that bordered on the miraculous. His task was to carve David out of a marble block weighing 12 tons, a task at which 2 sculptors before him had failed. It was the start of an obsession for Michelangelo. He spent 3 years working non-stop on the 5-meter statue, the first monumental sculpture of the High Renaissance. His David is a statement. Men equal to gods. That was almost the motto of the age.
The
image of mankind changed in the Renaissance. Pope Innocent III had said at the end of the 12th century that man was excrement, a slimy secretion, a contemptible creature. The medieval belief was that the sinful nature of man was visible on man. In the Renaissance, you could sense how tired people had become of this pessimistic view. The idea arose that man was almost like God. Man was God's creation, endowed with reason, with strengths, and as his image, man could almost become a god.
Around 10 years after the completion of his David, Michelangelo finished his Moses for the tomb of Pope Julius II. It too is larger than life. an angry prophet with bulging veins and a fearsome demeanor. In antiquity, that's how gods were depicted. Michelangelo learned from the masters of antiquity, but he didn't copy them. The Renaissance was more than just the rebirth of antiquity. Men like him created something new. They took the techniques and art of the ancient Greeks and Romans and developed them further.
You won't find a single artwork of the Renaissance that simply copied an ancient one. The crucial thing is that the Renaissance didn't just rediscover the critical minds of the Greeks, for example. It didn't just confront the science and scholarship of antiquity. It developed everything further. It invented completely new things, and it toppled the ancient giants who'd originally been its teachers.
A Renaissance work, Botticelli's Primavera, one of the best-known works of the West. Raphael's school of Athens glorified ancient thought. Then there's Leonardo's Mona Lisa, an icon of her age. For more than 1,000 years, it had fallen into oblivion, the skill of capturing the three-dimensional world realistically on a flat canvas, a quantum leap for architecture. The Renaissance rediscovered perspective. It emphasized symmetry. Architecture borrowing from antiquity was one of its themes. The art of building huge domes had fallen into oblivion in the Middle Ages. It was rediscovered in the Renaissance, but the Renaissance didn't limit itself to art. Thanks to the invention of double-entry bookkeeping, businessmen now knew what funds they had available when. As a result, the fortunes of the newly rich flowed into the pockets of the talented. An investment program for scholars and artists. Never before was so much invented and devised in such a short period of time. New machines were constructed, and the human machine was explored. It was a heyday for anatomy. It was also the first time people had followed the time. Another first, pocket-sized timepieces were invented, but from now on they also measured the orbits of the planets. The heavens-guided seafarers, adventurers discovered new trade routes. The known world tripled in size.
There's probably no place in the world where so much was discussed in one big conversation with such a large number of participants, where new things were invented in such quick succession. Printing triggered a huge discourse that captivated large parts of the population. Elites, scholars, and clerics too, of course, exchanged ideas. In this way, they invented groundbreaking new things.
But what were the triggers for this exceptional period of history? What were the ingredients of this explosive development? How come men like Michelangelo were suddenly masters of knowledge and techniques that had been lost for centuries? A look back in time. Rome in the 1st century. For the Romans of this era, the construction of St. Peter's would have been a feasible task. That's evidenced by the Forum Romanum, the power center of an empire that ruled the entire Western world, and one that exported its way of life to the farthest provinces. Rome dictated the art, culture, and architecture of an entire era. Rome was home to 1 million people at the time. That's 20 times more than one of the largest cities of the Renaissance, London. But Rome's dominance was built on the oppression of millions of slaves. Entire peoples were subjugated. For centuries, the Roman military machine succeeded in holding the empire together. But at some point, the barbarians got the upper hand. The Germanic tribes, the Goths and Vandals. In the 5th century, the Western Empire ceased to exist. Roma caput mundi, the capital of the world, the city that was home to 1 million, fell into decay. The Dark Ages began. The knowledge of antiquity was lost, knowledge in all areas, particularly in engineering, architecture, mathematics and physics. The ruins of antiquity were plundered as quarries. A few generations after the fall, nobody was any longer capable of creating anything remotely comparable. In 330 AD, the Roman Emperor Constantine had moved his capital to the Bosporus. Constantinople became the empire's new center. After that, the empire split into an eastern and western half. This Eastern Roman Empire survived as an ancient island on the Bosporus until the 15th century. It was home to more than 500,000 people. They called themselves Romaoi, Romans. Their emperors saw themselves as descendants of Caesar and Augustus. Constantinople was the second Rome, and its patriarch was the head of the Orthodox Christians. Something else too. Constantinople was the backup folder of antiquity. Its scholars were leading figures in every faculty. The Rome of the East was the bulwark of antiquity in a medieval world. Nobody had been able to conquer the city on the Bosporus. But 1/7 of the population were merchants from Genoa, Pisa and the Republic of Venice, known as Latins. An affluent minority unpopular with the Eastern Romans, with a reputation of being arrogant and quarrelsome. In early 1171, there were riots in the Genoese quarter in Pera. Emperor Manuel I, Komnenos, accused the Venetians of being troublemakers. Venetian merchants were arrested and locked up, and their possessions confiscated. Venice tried to defend its people, but in vain. It was the start of a conflict that lasted decades and ultimately ended in disaster for Constantinople. The conflict culminated in a crusade that went down in history as the Fourth. Not a crusade against people of a different faith, but a war waged by Catholic Christians against Orthodox Christians. And then the seemingly impossible happened. The Crusaders broke through the walls of Constantinople. On the night from the 12th to the 13th of April 1204, the resistance from the imperial troops collapsed. For 3 days, the Crusaders plundered the city, abusing, raping, and killing many of its residents. Emperor Alexios V managed to flee at first, but he was caught by the Crusaders, who blinded and killed him.
Es spielt eine große Rolle für die Entwicklung der
It played a major role for the development of the Renaissance that Byzantium collapsed, that it was damaged by the West during the Fourth Crusade, that it fell into the hands of the Ottoman Empire, and many scholars left for Italy, bringing manuscripts with them and trying to instill new values, texts, and ideas into a culture they perceived to be barbaric. It was a boost in innovation of hitherto unseen proportions.
Ungekannten Ausmaßes.
Treasures of immeasurable worth piled up in the libraries of Constantinople. the collective knowledge of antiquity. Hundreds of scholars and artists left the pillaged city and fled west, and they took valuable books with them. The scholar Manuel Chrysoloras was one of them. The Chancellor of Florence offered him a chair at his university. He also sent Chrysoloras a wish list of ancient works. A new era began with this exodus of Eastern Roman scholars. In this way too, techniques of ancient artists were rediscovered in the West. A level of movement, vitality and reality was captured in marble that had been unknown in the Middle Ages. Ancient frescoes inspired painters. Works of ancient engineering also reached the West. They triggered a wave of technical innovations. Ancient ideas of the movement of the heavenly bodies were taught once more. Science, and first and foremost maths and physics, experienced an unexpected revival after centuries of oblivion.
The Europeans learned from several civilizations. They learned from the Greeks and Romans, from the Arabs, from the Byzantines, and also from the Indians. The famous Arabic numbers actually came from India. They developed something new with what they learned. They didn't just copy. They learned these things and disseminated them through printing. They discussed the information in numbers that hadn't happened in any other culture before.
Florence in 1410, a city-state with a population of 50,000, the size of London and bursting with self-confidence. The Italian city was something of the Silicon Valley of the Renaissance. It was a font of knowledge. Elites from the East taught here, and it was a meeting place for artists and scholars. The plans for the Cathedral of Maria del Fiore were created in around 1300. Ambitious plans because it was to be the largest church in Christendom. A prestigious project, larger and more beautiful than the cathedrals in Pisa, Siena and Milan. And that's what it became. With a length of 153 meters, Florence Cathedral still ranks 4th in the world today. Back then, it was number 1. With a diameter of 45 meters, the dome was also a world record. The work on the 4,000 square meter fresco was begun by the painter Giorgio Vasari, who was also famous as an artist biographer. It was to compete with Michelangelo's Last Judgment, but Vasari's figures are lost in the height of the dome. Visitors down below can barely see them. In 1418, more than 100 years after its construction began, the cathedral remained unfinished. It was missing its dome. Nobody in the Middle Ages had the knowledge to solve the structural and technical problems. But then Filippo Brunelleschi came along. He was an architect and sculptor. Inspired by the ancient domes of the Pantheon and the Hagia Sophia, he had clear ideas about how to implement the ambitious project. Brunelleschi was also an engineer and an inventor. He developed special cranes for the dome's construction, new inventions that were to revolutionize building methods. Architecture students from the Technical University of Darmstadt in Germany have recreated Florence Cathedral on the computer. Using virtual models, they're analyzing every one of Brunelleschi's construction steps. His work, which came at the start of the Renaissance, is now considered the construction highlight of its era. His dome was double-walled and self-supporting. That was new. The dome was to the Renaissance what the tower had been to the Middle Ages, the expression of state power. The project head at the Technical University of Darmstadt is Mark Grellat, an internationally renowned expert in the field of computer reconstructions of historic buildings.
Brunelleschi wasn't just a brilliant builder, he was also an outstanding engineer. He invented construction machines that hadn't been around before. The ox crane, for example. This crane made it possible to get the stones up to the dome. He invented a brilliant system of gears, which meant that the materials could be lifted and lowered without removing the animals from their harness.
Brunelleschi's machines were a novelty of his era, and they were admired. The rope that carried the stones weighed half a ton. It was 7 centimeters thick and 180 meters long. Years later, the builder received the sole right to build a ship with a crane on it. It was the first patent in industrial history.
Brunelleschi was also known for rationalizing work processes. He got the men who were working on the dome to take their breaks and eat their meals up in the dome, which saved the time of them having to go up and down.
Brunelleschi's machines are similar to modern crane systems in how they work. They revolutionized the construction sites of the Renaissance. It's not just in its architecture that the Gothic period differs from the Renaissance. The predecessors of the Renaissance architects, the builders of the Gothic period, neither had the technical nor the structural knowledge Brunelleschi had. They worked by trial and error, ever higher and more delicate, but they had no mathematical way of calculating the structural limits of their constructions. The history of Gothic architecture is a history of failed experiments. There were no detailed architectural drawings either. All the planning took place in the architect's head. That's inconceivable from today's perspective. There was merely a plan that outlined the dimensions, a simple outline of the building.
In the Gothic period, you had 3 generations of architects working on one building. The idea and implementation takes place in the architect's head and cannot be separated from him. That wasn't the case in the Renaissance. There was a separation of design and construction.
Filippo Brunelleschi managed to rediscover perspective, a technique largely forgotten since antiquity. A geometrical system to depict 3-dimensional views realistically. That way, he managed to put the building down on paper, providing a visual basis for a discussion. It was the birth hour of the architect. Perspective drawing also inspired painters. Paintings became realistic projections of reality. Artists took viewers on a journey to a new world as if it were part of the scenery. The Renaissance paintings achieved a greater closeness to reality than ever before. This rediscovery of perspective drawing was a powerful engine of progress. And it was necessary for one of the most important tools used by architects today. CAD, computer-aided design, the 3D animation of a building. The virtual construction work starts before the actual construction. CAD is a realistic depiction of reality. It provides the data for computer-controlled robotic systems. Robots that build independently are still a vision for the future, but the technology to make it happen was invented by Brunelleschi more than half a millennium ago.
Brunelleschi didn't invent perspective drawing, but he represented a milestone on the road from antiquity to the Renaissance. He developed a recipe with which you, anyone, could construct a realistic perspective for every object, step by step. As a result, everyone could design buildings and create realistic paintings. Suddenly, architects were able to design 10, 20 buildings, while an architect in the Gothic period spent his entire life on a single construction site.
In Italy's competing city-states, particularly in Venice, Milan, Florence and Pisa, the hip architects became some of the top earners of the Renaissance. They weren't nameless like they had been in the Middle Ages. They were celebrated and pampered elites. Venetian noblemen paid for palaces in the new style. The Swiss architect Antonio Contino designed and built the Bridge of Sighs. It's one of the most photographed motifs in the world. The new construction style became an export hit. The City Hall in Zurich is a masterpiece of the late Renaissance. 100 years earlier, the sculptor and builder Anton Isenman had built one of the most picturesque examples of Italian Renaissance in Switzerland, Lucerne Town Hall. A high-tech building based on Albrecht Dürer's plan for the ideal defensive structure. Monod Fortress in northern Switzerland, captivating in its symmetry. Symmetry and borrowed from antiquity, a clear system for the arrangement of columns, arches and domes. Architecture, gardens and sculptures came together to form a total artwork. It sought to please, be decorative and provide enjoyment for people, not praise God.
Die mittelalterliche Kunst war im Wesentlichen
Medieval art was basically religious art. That's in part evidenced by the fact that we only know some of the artists. Although it was customary to sign individual things, we often speak of the master of such and such, whose name we don't even know. In the Renaissance, we see the trend to the named author of a work. Art became free from religious motifs. It turned towards everyday life. It also described everyday life more accurately. If we think of perspective drawing, for example, they tried to describe everyday life in detail.
Man versucht den Alltag ganz genau zu beschreiben und mächtige.
Powerful and extremely self-confident artists came to the fore. They confronted the powerful. They made their demands. They were courted by the powerful. Michelangelo, for example. He was an artist who would dictate certain things to the Pope.
Punkte diktieren kann.
In 1347, the Black Death broke out in Europe. It killed around 45% of the population in England within just 7 months. Hundreds of thousands died. There's no comparable catastrophe in history. After that, nothing was the same anymore. A trauma that was processed in art. The plague changed the world. In the end, it even changed people themselves.
It might sound cynical, but the plague didn't just have a negative effect on the culture of the Renaissance and the arts. The wealth of the dead was concentrated in the hands of the survivors. And those who survived saw life with completely different eyes. Some will have said, let's enjoy our days and spend them in the best way possible. Maybe they wanted to surround themselves with beautiful art. Others will have wanted to straighten their accounts with God and do something for the well-being of their soul, like Medici, who built an entire church. It's certain that the plague deeply influenced the people's attitude to life.
The imperative of the Renaissance was, live in this life, enjoy your life. That hadn't been the case in the Middle Ages. Naked bodies everywhere, beautiful people enmeshed in idyllic landscapes, open eroticism. Michelangelo's Last Judgment. The heavenly hosts are naked with discernible genitalia, a revolution. The plague completely ravaged Florence. Only a fifth of the city's population survived the Black Death. The plague also changed how wealth was distributed. It promoted a new species: tycoons, people who were unimaginably rich. Families like the Medici, merchants and bankers, people who were despised in the feudal society of the Middle Ages. Now they were the ones in charge. A journey to the year 1425. The sculptor Donatello and his patron, Cosimo de' Medici, the first great sponsor of the arts. A wealthy banker, a reserved tactician, a strategist with almost mafia-like methods. He was one of the richest men of his day. His money was the fuel for the development of art and architecture in Florence and the spark that ignited the Italian Renaissance. But his success never would have been possible without a small invention that had revolutionized banking. A simple formal financial instrument became a catalyst. Two accounts were kept: the credit account with takings and the debit account with outgoings. The first complete double-entry bookkeeping system can be dated to 1340. Ledgers from Genoa with the income and expenditure of the government. The account holder knew at all times how much capital he had. He was able to compare his financial past to his present. Konrad Hummler, a well-known Swiss entrepreneur, journalist, patron, and former private banker, knows what that meant.
Es kommt ein reicher Mann auf Sie zu.
A rich man comes to you with a sack of money.
Ist wirklich reich?
But is he really rich?
Liquiditätszustand.
If you look at his liquid assets,
Wenn man aber
then
weiß,
yes.
dass unter Umständen
But if you know that he has debts, then maybe his net worth is negative.
das heißt, ist pleite.
He's bankrupt.
Anderen Worten,
You can find out more about the economy if you do double entry accounts. And cash flows can only be depicted through double entry bookkeeping too.
dank der doppelten
You can show too what happens over time in the economy.
Wirtschaft passiert. Und da kommt dann auch das
Double entry bookkeeping allowed for a greatly expanded perspective of what was happening in the economy.
Das heißt, eine bedeutende Ausweitung der Sichtweisen auf die Wirtschaft.
The Medici were bankers. They issued loans and signed secure credit notes for travellers that could be cashed in many countries, the precursors to travellers' checks. They were global players. Cosimo de' Medici earned huge sums and spent them again. By the time of his death, 600,000 florins, more than €250 million, in taxes, donations to the needy, on buildings and on art. A whole pool of creative individuals, artists and architects were dependent on his money. They in turn made his life nicer. Medici Palace is a glorious stage of Renaissance art. It's hard to believe that Cosimo instructed the architect not to make it too magnificent, as he didn't want to rouse the envy of other patrician families. The Medici invested in the well-being of their souls as well. They donated money for a new church, the Basilica di San Lorenzo. As patron, Cosimo de' Medici supported artists' careers and something that had never existed in this form before: the celebrity cult.
Dieser Star entsteht in einem
This celebrity arose in an intellectual greenhouse climate, in a market full of competition, where humanists, creatives and artists of all kinds were supported, often very well paid by patrons. They, in turn, hoped for more fame and standing for their courts through these artists. Fantasy increasingly came to the fore, over the actual ability of the painter or the sculptor. In this way, you had some standout figures in this busy market, whose status was known at the time and is still known to us today. That means the underestimated artist, the suffering genius, will have been a particularly frequent phenomenon.
Eine besonders häufige Erscheinung damals gewesen, ja.
Donatello was one of the first great artist celebrities of the Renaissance. He was almost 60 when he showed Cosimo de' Medici the designs for his David. The boy who defeated Goliath is his most significant work, a brave work, because Donatello's David is naked. Only a few generations earlier, ancient statues were destroyed simply for portraying nudity. Donatello's David was the first sculpture of a naked, life-sized person since antiquity. Medici and Donatello certainly will have been aware of the revolutionary nature of this work.
Unlike other cultures, the Renaissance didn't worry about depicting naked bodies, or almost naked bodies. That was very significant for medicine. You can't study anatomy if you can't depict naked bodies. That was crucial for a different understanding of people. A person wasn't just animated by his spirits and guided by his stars. Instead, he was a mechanically controlled machine, an organism.
Before Donatello, nobody had been brave enough to depict a human body uncovered. That was as unusual as his interpretation. Donatello's David is no muscle man. Rather, he's a youth with somewhat feminine traits and fascinatingly lifelike. Like Donatello's David, the model, a sports student, has shifted his weight onto one leg, the engaged leg. The other, the free leg, is relieved. He copies David's pose exactly, an experiment in the lab that analyzes movement sequences at the Sports University of Cologne. The artist and artwork are put to the test. Cameras record every movement phase. A program translates the film footage into computer data. Denise Temmer is a professor of dance and movement culture. She's monitoring the experiment. She wants to find out how well Donatello understood the movement apparatus and anatomy of the human body. It's almost impossible to stand in such a relaxed manner when you've got your weight on both legs. He's standing contrapposto, meaning his weight is shifted to one side, so he's resting on his hip. The shoulder blades stick out, and his tummy also follows gravity in this position. We see a very relaxed stance, but because it's not broad, it can move in any direction. He's standing on one leg and can shift his weight very quickly and get going. The principle behind contrapposto was already known to Greek sculptors 2,000 years ago. After almost a whole millennium, the artists of the Renaissance picked it up again. Donatello before all the others. They copied human poses very realistically. Michelangelo's slave statues combined the relaxed element of the contrapposto with the tension of someone in shackles. Michelangelo, like Donatello, knew about human anatomy.
Entweder hat Donatello ein sehr gutes Bewegungssehen oder
Either Donatello had his own ideas about movement or he had his own experience, which he was able to depict, because he depicted certain details very well, details that we didn't even think about when we tried to recreate the pose. The shape of the gluteal muscle, which is completely relaxed, the folds the muscle hangs over, the very flexible joints as a result of the muscle tension being so relaxed. With a trained sports student, we hardly manage to create the position of the hip on the right-hand side because they need very high muscle tension. It's a very flexible David, and that's been captured in great detail.
Das hat eben, finde ich, sehr detailliert eingefangen.
But where did Donatello get his knowledge of the human body? With the enthusiasm of the early Renaissance for all things classical, interests in anatomy grew as well. Almost all the artists, sculptors and painters of the Renaissance will have studied human anatomy, at least in theory. An illegal trade in fresh corpses flourished, but many places imposed draconian punishments for this crime. However, curiosity triumphed over fear. It's possible that Donatello dissected corpses too, just like Albrecht Dürer, Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci 1 or 2 generations later. But even in Donatello's time in the early Renaissance, the structure of the human body was known to artists. This knowledge allowed new, very lifelike depictions of people. Men like Donatello were either artistically talented scholars or scholarly artists. As the analysis by Cologne Sports University would suggest, Donatello's knowledge of the human movement apparatus went much further than previously believed. The surprising thing about Donatello is that almost 600 years ago, he had a David cast in bronze whose stance, according to modern research, represents an ideal in movement efficiency.
Steht nicht etwa straff da und macht sich einen Panzer, gerade zu sein.
Straight and tall, he's standing very efficiently. That principle has been captured in a very visceral way. He's strikingly upright with almost no muscle tension.
So eine auffällige Aufrichtung hat.
As fate would have it, Donatello's interpretation of the Old Testament hero didn't achieve the same popularity as another sculpture of the Renaissance, one that was also created in Florence. Michelangelo's David. At 5 meters tall, it's a monumental statue in the pose of a god. Half a century after Donatello, it was a symbol of the self-confidence of the new man, the Renaissance man.
Das Eruptive an der Renaissance ist, dass
The explosive thing about the Renaissance was that people became aware of their strengths and abilities in a new way. They unfolded an incredible energy with regard to their thinking and actions in business and technology. Human self-confidence skyrocketed.
menschlichen Selbstbewusstseins.
In the Middle Ages, more than 90% of people were illiterate. The few who could read and write were exclusively men of the church. They were the ones who produced books, owned them and looked after them like treasures. The life's work of a single copyist, 10 to 15 books. That makes them unimaginably valuable. One book back then cost the same as a farmhouse.
Ein schöner Kodex, eine
A nice codex, such as a Bible, would require you to kill an entire flock of sheep, and that's expensive.
kann man allmählich
But then books could be bought for little money.
wohlfeileren Preis
That meant reading became democratic.
demokratisiert. Wissen,
More and more people were able to participate in discussions about new ideas.
wissenschaftlichen Gespräch, an der Diskussion über Neuerungen.
That's the only way we can explain how Europe became the continent of innovations,
Der Kontinent der Innovation
much more than any other continent.
Ausmaß als jeder andere Kontinent, als jedes andere Fleckchen Erde.
The men of the church didn't just copy works, they also changed them and falsified sources. They claimed their interpretation was the word of God. That gave them power. But in the Renaissance, their monopoly on knowledge, one of the most important bastions of the church, disappeared.
Es entsteht ein Wahrheits- und
An
Quellenbewusstsein.
awareness for sources and the truth developed. not least because sources were now accessible. People started analyzing these sources with classical techniques. The traditional myths put forward by the Church simply weren't accepted anymore.
Mainz in 1450. His invention is maybe the most significant in 1,000 years, but we don't even know what he looked like. Johannes Gutenberg, a printer in the city. His achievement was to combine the methods of reproduction and printing into one overall system. His hand mold was at the heart of his printing press. It allowed letters to be printed faster and more finely. In short, it was the invention of modern printing. And so it was the birth hour of mass communication. The principle back then was exactly the same as today. People multiply opinions. That also changed the value of people attached to information. During the Renaissance, the printed word was worth more because people could read it black on white.
Printing was of truly enormous significance, and Gutenberg is the person who did the most of consequence in world history in 1,000 years. Reading became increasingly widespread. The huge developments and the great religious revolution, the Reformation, wouldn't have been possible without printing.
In the first 60 years after the invention of printing, 400 Bible editions were published in the languages of the people. At the same time, the number of lay people who were able to read and write increased. More and more people now had direct and immediate access to biblical texts, the Word of God.
The people of the Renaissance felt close to God. They felt themselves becoming godlike. They wouldn't have said that in the Middle Ages. It would have been considered blasphemous. People referred to the Bible and said they were God's creation. God made us in His image. We're almost miniature gods. God came closer to people in the Renaissance than He ever was in the Middle Ages.
But it wasn't books that made up the bulk of the business of the printing shops. It was fly sheets. They were affordable and cost 2 to 3 hours' wages for a laborer. Everyone was able to print fly sheets and so disseminate his opinions, verses and drawings. 3 subjects dominated: sensations and miracles, religious instruction, and political and military propaganda. The illustrated fly sheets also developed the first caricatures. They were an invitation, an opinion, or a warning. Comparable to today's social networks, they took advantage of a fundamental need: the mass dissemination of one's own opinion.
Zur Renaissance gehören Flugblätter.
The Renaissance had fly sheets. It had literature that was printed and spread very quickly. It would be printed in Nuremberg tomorrow, and in 2 days' time, it would be in Zurich. Information became faster and was much harder to control, too. Church censorship, that doesn't stick anymore because the fly sheets have long since been spread around. You can only understand the huge boom in free thinking in the Renaissance if you look at the media and at the fly sheets in particular.
Auf die Druckgeschichte und insbesondere auf die Flugblätter.
Mass communication generated a new kind of person, the celebrity. Its creator was Giorgio Vasari, a painter and architect himself, but mainly a biographer of the most fascinating public figures of his day, artists. He was particularly taken with Leonardo da Vinci, but he also produced portraits of Raphael and Michelangelo. Leonardo was unconventional, a miracle of creativity, highly talented, strange with a vanity that bordered on the grotesque, a man who wasn't scared of acknowledging his homosexuality. Vasari was the first to coin the term Rinascita, Renaissance, and who gave his artists the aura that made them stars, shining lights of society.
konstruiert ein Bild.
He created the image of an artist which hadn't existed before. Most artists were craftsmen. That's how they saw themselves, and that's how others saw them. But Vasari created the image of the genius, the strange, crazy man, the artist who is overcome by ideas. He paints a picture of an artist that seems strangely familiar today. He created the modern artist.
Konstruiert den modernen Künstler.
The painter Holbein was the first to paint a portrait of his family. The star painters Botticelli and Albrecht Dürer even painted self-portraits. The self-portrait became the expression of a new self-confidence. And finally along came Raphael and Tizian, the first painters to sign their paintings, a further step towards the notion of the star. The great names in art suddenly became world famous. 100 years earlier, that would have been unthinkable. Titans of the Renaissance, first and foremost Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, were celebrated, invited to court, and paid handsomely. In 1300, then Venetian glassblowers invented the convex mirror, an invention whose importance is underestimated. Compared to the mirrors of the antiquity, the Venetian variety provided an almost undistorted likeness and a bright image. Most people of the Middle Ages will only have seen their face as a blurry reflection in water. The glass mirror was the first time people could really see themselves. Maybe that's why the people of the Renaissance were more self-confident than their medieval counterparts. Self-confidence and pride in their personal achievements weren't sinful anymore. Humility was no longer in tune with the times.
Der Mensch, der den Kopf erhebt,
The person who keeps his chin up, who walks tall in the presence of God, who uses reason as his special gift from God. These are the new values. As a result, humility becomes less important. As humans, we're capable, and God wants us to be capable.
so dass wir etwas können und tun.
But what was the secret of the titans of the Renaissance? Did they have a magic formula for their creativity? Their charisma is, in any case, still with us.